Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tate. Welcome all Mennonite and Mennonite adjacent individuals here to the atrium at McNally Robinson Booksellers. It's a great pleasure to have you all here today as we celebrate the actual launch, not just the Winnipeg launch, of In Search of a Mennonite Imagination, Key Texts in Mennonite Literary Criticism, edited, of course, by Robert Zacharias. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that, of course, the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We have an incredible slate of readers here this evening, so I won't take up too much more of your time. The only thing I will point out is that following a presentation from Robert and some readings from some of the contributors, there will be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So allow those to percolate over the course of the evening. When it comes time for the Q&A, just put up your hand and I'll approach you non-threateningly with this microphone, and that'll just ensure everyone watching at home can hear the questions as well. I'll be back at the close of the event to offer you information about signing, which is very straightforward. But for now, I have the great pleasure of introducing the editor of this volume. And I will also extend, before I do, enormous thanks to Sue, who is, of course, the heart and soul of CMU Press, for helping to get this volume together and for bringing it to us this evening. So, of course, Robert Zacharias is Associate Professor in the Department of English at York University in Toronto and Associate Editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies. He's author of Reading Mennonite Writing, a study in minor transnationalism, and Rewriting the Break Event, Mennonites in Migration in Canadian Literature, and editor of After Identity, Mennonite Writing in North America. Please give a very warm welcome to Robert Zacharias.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you to the folks at McNally Robinson, to whoever set up these chairs here in this lovely space. It's always a treat to be in Canada's best bookstore. This is the third time I've had a chance to be launching a book here, and it's wonderful to be back. I have some thank yous that I need to begin with, because if I forget them, I won't be able to sleep tonight. So thank you for sure to Sue Sorensen, who I cannot see. There we are at CMU Press for the, what's the right adjective? Gargantuous amount of effort and work that she put in to this project, to Jonathan Dick for making it look so beautiful, to Katie Doki-Sawatsky for helping gather permissions and all that sort of work behind the scenes, and the small army of proofreaders who came on board to read through every sentence time and again to make sure that the work will shine. But really to Sue in particular, I want to acknowledge that she went well beyond what is reasonable expectations with this project. So half apologies and half thanks. So thank you very much, Sue, for your work here. And of course, I'll have my thanks for all the contributors to the volume, many of whom are here today, which is exciting for us. We'll have a chance to hear from some of them at the mic in a few minutes' time. I'll read from my thanks in the book to make sure I do that correctly. And then, of course, thank you to all of you for joining us here tonight. I know we've got the Mennonite Writing Conference over at CMU later tonight for the next couple of days, and it's so great to have the opportunity to do this in person, where so many of us are here gathered already. So thank you for joining us tonight. And lastly, but definitely not least, thank you to that hardworking employee at Friesen's Publishers, whoever that was, who literally drove here at 5 o'clock, I believe, with the copies of the press. So when I called after having flown in to say, are there books here? They said, don't worry, Friesens has got it covered. They'll be here by 5. At which point I said, can we do a launch without a book? Just hypothetically speaking. And they said, don't worry, it's going to be fine. And indeed it was. So thank you to whoever that was, firing down the prairie roads. Okay, so in search of a Mennonite imagination, key texts in Canadian, or in Mennonite literary criticism, not just Canadian, is, as the name suggests, an anthology of Mennonite literary criticism in English. My plan for the next 20 minutes or so will be to tell you a little bit about the project, how it came to be, why it's so big, and so on. And then I'd like to take some time to dip into the book. I'll have an opportunity to read you just short passages from some of the earliest work in the material so you get a sense of what's in the archive, what Mennonites we're talking about poetry, about fiction in the late 1800s, early 20th century, and we'll juxtapose that against readings from some of the contributors who are here with us today. We'll step back and forth. So we'll get just a paragraph or so from some early periodicals from the 1800s, and then we'll leap forward into the present moment. And hopefully by the end of the hour, you'll get a sense of the range, the scope of interests, the form of this conversation that's been sometimes separate and scattered, sometimes dovetailing into a true critical debate, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. But I'd like to start by telling you about how the project came to be, and I write about that in the preface. So rather than me trying to do it off the top of my head, let me read a paragraph here. Several years ago, the good folks at Canadian Mennonite University reached out to me with an invitation. The press had a new director, Sue Sorensen, who was interested in broadening its focus to include literary studies. And she was ready to ask if I might have any ideas for a scholarly project on Mennonite literature. I remember I dashed off a response about the field's real need for an anthology of Mennonite literary criticism, something that would gather together the key texts in the field, many of which were out of print or otherwise difficult to track down. Mennonite literature, I pointed out, continues to explode, and there's a need for a good resource to help provide a critical context for the new scholarship that was emerging to engage it. And more than that, I added, it seemed to me that Mennonite literary criticism, like many fields of criticism, bends heavily towards the contemporary. And it would be helpful to historicize the field by placing its key works into a productive conversation with the larger and longer tradition of criticism and commentary about Mennonites and literature, to offer an informed peek into the archive, as it were, and remind ourselves of the field's broader history. But I reasoned, an anthology like this would need to be a huge project for it to be done well. Even after deciding on the contents, it would require a huge amount of work to turn everything into Word documents, track down images, authors, publishers, and permissions. Plus, it would be a nightmare to copy edit. It would surely take years, I reasoned, and would likely be prohibitively expensive in any case. The whole thing really was frankly unrealistic. Sue immediately called my bluff, and I began work on the project in the fall of 2022. So this is a true story. This is how the project began, a cold call, a sort of, wouldn't it be nice if someone else would do this type of project? And somehow became several years of work in the making. Those emails began sometime, I think in 2021. And by the time I got around to formal book proposals, it was 2022. I was looking at that proposal earlier today and see that I was sure and confident we could have this done by March 2023. So we are a bit behind, but right on time, just before the conference. Now, in my defense, I think I was right about at least one thing. The scale of the project is enormous, if not unreasonable. The first bibliography that we put together as a maybe we could include these texts was well over 1,000 entries by the end of my research assistant's help. The roughly 350 articles I printed off for closer examination filled 5 3-inch binders on my shelf. And so it became a matter of not so much what to include, but how do you get rid of, what do you not include is a better way to think of it. And we came up with a few parameters that I think are worth sharing, just so you have a sense of what's here, but maybe also what's not here. So with very few exceptions, the decision was made to include work that was explicitly looking at that relationship between the terms Mennonite and literature. So it means we haven't included close readings of individual texts, right? So a full essay on Rudy Weed's Speech to Destroy Meaning might be an exception, but there aren't many essays dedicated to a single text or single author. Instead, we're looking for texts that are grappling with these larger questions of those key terms and the relationship between them. This does mean leaving out some fabulous work that you should leave here and look up. It also means setting aside, for the most part, individual reviews. And when you dive into the archives, those reviews are really one of the key places that Mennonite literary criticism, a conversation about Mennonite literature, what that might be, is it terrible or just bad, and sort of began. And so we've included a couple of reviews here, but really the scale there is so wide that we haven't included many. We also decided to include works only in their entirety. So there are some excellent full book-length studies of Mennonite literature out there, but we thought rather than trying to excerpt pieces and figure what do we leave in, what do we leave out, we said these are works that are best understood in their entirety, and for the most part, those are relatively recent works, fairly easy to get your hands on. We thought they're best served by maintaining them there, staying in there, and engaged in their entirety. So we've left those aside. So that means no selections from Maggie's Making Believe, or Danish Cruise's Querying Mennonite Literature, and so on. And then finally, I really wanted to try to use this project as an opportunity to stretch the boundaries of the historical nature of the field. Like I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of the work in the field has tended to engage the recent work, the recent explosion of Mennonite writing in North America. And that's well and good, and this is really where there's been a meaningful critical conversation where people are citing each other, building on arguments, and that's fabulous. However, there's a much longer history of people writing and asking questions about that relationship between Mennonites and literature. And I wanted to bring some of that work from the archive, bring it out here and collect it and set it alongside this more recent, robust conversation so we get a sense of the larger contexts out of which the more recent work has emerged. So after narrowing down to the rough table of contents, I circulated it out to a bunch of folks in the field, said, what do you think? And started the process of negotiation, choosing, picking what stays in and what ends up having to be set aside. And in the end, we settled on this tight 734 pages, I believe. You can't miss a word. I couldn't take out another word. It features 53 articles by 44 different authors, originally published in 26 different venues over the past 154 years. It clocks in, as I said, around 730 pages, which for the copy editors among you is well over 250,000 words. Each of the essays I prefaced with a brief introduction, like a page max, in which I introduce the author and the argument and offer a short bibliography of related work in the field. So the idea is, if you're coming to this work from 1923, I say, this is this person who's writing, this is the venue in which they're writing, this is why it's significant, and here's a short summary of what I see the argument being. And it's followed by several entries for future reading. If you're interested in this one, if you like this, you're gonna love these 4 articles as well. Because the spirit of the project is that it's a place, despite its size, is that it's a place to start, rather than a place to end the engagement with Mennonite literary criticism. So the first article is John F. Funk's Writing Poetry, published in the Herald of Truth in 1869. And the most recent is Casey Platt's Authority, Storytelling and Community, published in Mennonite Quarterly Review in 2023. So the work reflects many academic venues. So we've included everything from Canadian literature, history and anthology, of course, Mennonite academic journals, such as the Journal of Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Quarterly Review, Conrad Grable Review, and Mennonite Life. There are articles in small literary magazines, such as Festival Quarterly and Rhubarb, work from early Mennonite denominational periodicals, like the Mennonite, the Gospel Herald, and the Young People's Paper, also through to national venues such as Books in Canada and the New York Times. And of course, there's collections, essays from individual essay collections as well. Much of this is difficult to find. It's taking a lot of time, so we're bringing it together in the hope that folks who are interested in the field will have this as a resource moving forward. The process for getting permissions for this range of material was at times a bit of an adventure, but I want to say sincere thanks to the authors themselves, all of whom were generous in their responses and allowing us to reprint the material. Less so a few of the journals, but we will leave some of those unnamed, except to say that in one case, I had to tell a scholar that, we just can't afford a couple of $1,000s to reprint this single essay from the 80s in this collection, as much as I'd like to see it there. And this contributor said, just hold on, don't make any key decisions quite yet, and launched into a several-month email battle with a major publisher that involved lawyers and the like, and in the end, got a terse letter that said, do not agree with your interpretation of the copyright. However, we will make an exception and will generously allow your work to be included. So thank you, James Erg, for your hard work in getting your work into this piece. Okay, so I'd like to take some time to dip into the work itself. Before I do that, let me say thanks to the folks who have contributed this work. And I'll read again from the preface to make sure I get it right. And of course, my sincere thanks go to the many scholars whose work is included here. As the earliest of these essays were originally published in the mid-19th century, many of the writers whose work is included here have long since passed on, and it's my hope that the project honors their efforts in bringing the work back into the critical conversation. I did my best to track down each of the living authors whose work is included in the volume to request permission to reprint the material, and I was gratified when the responses I received were filled with enthusiasm and grace for the project. It does take a certain form of grace, after all, to allow one's work from years ago, in some cases many decades ago, to return into the contemporary critical context for re-examination. Many of the scholars whose work is included here continue to write about Mennonite literature, and several express some apprehension with the prospect of reprinting work that no longer fully reflects their current thinking on the field. To such concerns, I typically responded by quoting from the preface of Julia Spiker-Kasdorf's collection of essays, The Body in the Book, where Kasdorf addressed this concern directly. She agreed to let her earlier work be republished, she writes, only after Rudy Weed pointed out to her that it may well prove useful to a new generation of readers and writers, even, or perhaps especially, where they do not fully agree with it. She agreed to the reprint, as she puts it, by the deeply Mennonite logic that, quote, the prospect of being useful to someone trumps shame. The good news, I think, is that there's little to be ashamed of in the essays collected here, even if the author's thinkings may well have changed since they were first published, and every reason to believe the material will be useful to the others in the future. I think I'll pause there because I know we've got half a dozen folks or so whose work is represented here. And it really is about providing, bringing some of this material back into public conversation, and especially to bring them sort of stacked beside each other. So what I invited them to do, and they've been gracious enough to agree, is to come up one at a time to read like a paragraph or so. This is an ask for academics, by the way. To read just a paragraph from one of their earlier works. Maybe I'll ask you just to introduce yourself. I know that most of us know each other. Introduce yourself, remind us of what you're reading from, and read maybe one paragraph. And then as that person is having a seat, I'm going to read a paragraph from an earlier piece. So we get a bit of a sense of the range of points, of perspectives and points that are reflected in the collection as a whole. So I think I asked Casey if you'd start us off. So I'll ask Casey Plett to come on up here. The others who we've chatted with about coming up to present, maybe I'll just one at a time. As I'm reading, the next folks will come up. And do you want to hide under the tree, or do you want to come?
I'm a little small.
Yeah, why don't we swap?
What a great idea. Okay. Thank you, Rob. Hello, I'm Casey Plett. It is so good to be here with all of you. I'm going to read a short bit from my essay in here, Authority, Storytelling, and Community. Starting from the third section. Sophia Samatar has a section in her short story, Fallow, where the main character, Agar, gives a presentation to a group of futuristic Mennonites on sordid parts of their history, which does not go well. Quote, "This episode in our history was a wound. The cells of the body sprang into action when it was touched, dosing about it, closing it down." There's another quote earlier in the story. Quote, "I understood then that she had a horror of the exercise of power, not only the obvious sorts of power, the rod, the shout, but the type we knew most intimately, the power of the group. She had a horror of the downcast eye that waits for others to act," end quote. She's talking about a teacher here, a very kind teacher who dies by suicide later in the story, whose classroom starts to go rowdy and form against her. And the teacher's instinct is to know that the group will always win against her, the group too, of course, being a kind of community. Ever since I read Marion Tase's Women Talking, I have been mesmerized and haunted by its narrator, August Epp, who is so unlike every other fictional protagonist from that author. August does not want to be seen. He is suicidal and homeless, and he leaves England for his tiny former home of the Lochta colony, even though he is disliked there, simply because that is, quote, "where life had made sense." Where life had made sense. That is enough to bring him back to where life made sense.
Thank you, Casey. I'm going to read a short passage from the first piece in the collection. This was first published, if I can find it. 1869 in the Herald of Truth. It's John F. Funk, and it's called Writing Poetry. He's the editor of the Herald of Truth at the time. "We hope our friends and correspondents will bear in mind that we do not need quite so much poetry and more prose. For some time past, we have received quite a large number of poetical articles, many of which we were compelled to consign to the wastebasket, some on account of the indistinctiveness of the handwriting, others for the reason that there was no meaning or idea contained in the composition of the article, and others again because the poetry is too poor. There are a good many points to be observed in writing poetry, and unless poetry is well written, it had better not be written at all. For the editor to take a piece of badly written poetry and try to revise and arrange it is like trying to repair a house built on the sand. The more one works at it, the worse it becomes."
Thank you. I hope this will pass the test of your lurking editor. Robert, I don't know what you were thinking. It's such a small book. In history, twice as big. No, congratulations. See how much work this was to put this together, and what an interesting new genealogy you have given us to play with in our literary cultural history. Okay, I'm going to read you two paragraphs from my essay called Paradigms of Replacement, Relocation, and Revision, which was in a different collection of Robert's, and we launched it here, didn't we? A few years ago.
This was in JMS. This was in Journal of Ethnic Studies.
Yeah, but then it was in an anthology here again. I was the first woman writer from the traditionalist DARPA of Southern Manitoba. And then there was a very big backlash later against me, which is still ongoing in many places, in many ways. And this is an essay in which I'm trying to talk about what was going on, what is being negotiated there. This is where we got stuck, isn't it? In the question of who owns the story of our people and who gets to tell it. In our disagreements about which parts of our traditionalist culture and heritage we want to keep and hold on to, and which we are willing to let go or change. As we become ever more assimilated into the modern paradigm and economy we spent so many centuries trying to avoid. In the question of who gets to say what it means to be a good Mennonite, straddled as we are now between highly contradictory and conflicting cultural paradigms and ways of life. Who is right, whose job it is to say so. These are partly issues of oral copyright, partly issues of authority and community organization, and partly issues of spirituality, of understanding the difference between the stories and spaces that are sacred or private and need to be protected, and those that can be spoken aloud and shared, and partly issues of gender, and those voices and stories that must be spoken aloud and shared to prevent abuse of vulnerable persons.
Thank you, Di. I'm going to jump ahead to 1985 to Katie Funk Wee's The Mennonite Woman in Mennonite Fiction. Who then is a Mennonite woman according to the image created by the novelist? Is the image a credible one? Her idealized role as Great Mother, Earth Mother, Eve before the fall, passive, gentle, subdued, forces her into being a reactor rather than a person who personally forges her faith in the furnace of daily living through her own decisions. Mennonite peace issues are not her concern. She does not personally find grace for redemption, but receives her faith by a process of osmosis through the virtue of being her husband's wife. To think and act in these novels is a male prerogative. If she experiences a conflict, it is resolved by her acceptance of the private sphere only appropriate for her. Generally, if her values differ from men's, masculine values prevail. Her relationship to the men in her life is rarely as significant as her relationship to the children. The Mennonite woman is seldom pictured as genuinely, ecstatically happy. Even with mothering, life is serious, even fearful, and her acceptance of her lot in life with its aggression of pain, suffering, and forced silence is her main task. The reader looks in vain for a female character who's competent, confident, intelligent, curious, straightforward in the role of wife and mother, and eager to be about the business of living. Attempts to move her out of stereotyped roles in the Mennonite community are considered wrong. And although it's possible to leave at great cost, the departure rarely achieves self-identity. If this image is realistic and not merely an image merely a reflection of a created image of Mennonite women, then the Mennonite experience would seem to deny women the right to full humanity. The question the reader must ask is whether the weakness reflected in the literature is actually there in the women or merely in the way the community has molded that image. Paul, message come up.
Congratulations, Rob, on this terrific project. Rob helped me a lot in the production of an article that's mine, and it's in here, and it's about Rudy Weebe's novel, Peace Shall Destroy Many, and the front cover of the novel is portrayed, pictured here on page 629 rather. And it's the front cover was designed and written and concocted by a guy called Frank Neufeld. And people generally think Frank Neufeld is somebody from the DARPA, where Di and others maybe come from. But actually, he was an immigrant fleeing from Czechoslovakia, and a Jewish designer, book designer, and had an enormous impact on design work in books in Canada. I pick him as one of the English. Among Mennonite people, a lot of you will remember the days when anyone, Japanese or anyone, was called the English if they were living in Canada and not Mennonite. And my project is really about the fact that without the English, we wouldn't really exist at all. And I'm deeply reminded of this with words like McNally Robinson, although I'm sure McNally isn't an English word. So I conclude by saying readers, after they finish this piece that I've written in here, can now identify the presence of the English in this quintessentially Mennonite novel, Peace Shall Destroy Many. They can even celebrate the blurb on the front as a performance that loosens the book from its didactic moorings and multiplies its meanings and audiences, giving it an extra life alongside the one claimed and projected by Weebe alone. Rudy Weebe himself, who is now 90 and still much kicking, has always denied the existence of Frank Neufeld on the front cover. And to this day, I've tried to convince him that, there was that guy. Neufeld's vivid presence enables us to acknowledge as essential a critical paradigm that accounts for the non-Mennonite participants who add legitimation and success to the Mennonite literary experiment. Given the role that Pichot's Drameny has taken on as a myth of origins for Mennonite writers, it is a paradigm that points to the hybrid origins of the Mennonite literary identity itself, to Mennonite literary culture as predicated on and validated by the participation and presence of the English.
My next reading will be from the Young People's Paper, 1896, from Weber, and it's titled Read the Poem. Read the poem slowly. Nearly everybody reads too fast as well as too much. Do not pay attention to details until later. Don't attempt to understand this line or that stanza before you're ready for it. Poetry aims to please. It deals with higher life. Its themes are often too spiritual to be snugly put into the heavy harness of language. Hence, it's not as clear as prose and cannot always be expounded in so many words. It can be better felt. First, watch the poem as a whole. Try to grasp the central thought, the pith, the marrow, the essence, the life, the soul. For every good poem has one thought that is monarch over all subservient ideas in it. It's not to be found in any particular line or couplet, but throughout the whole, just as some faces have peculiarly pleasant expressions. Not the chin, not the shape of the lips, nor the mold of the nose, nor the forehead, nor even the eyes. It is in the face and the predominant thought that is the poem. And
Hi, I'm Ann Hustetler, and I really am so deeply appreciative of Rob and his ability to appreciate the writing of others and historically, as well as with the ongoing contemporary writing of people. So congratulations, and I'm very pleased and a little embarrassed to be included in here, as you were talking about, if it's useful to the project, because these essays in here are both written over 20 years ago when I was just trying to figure out stuff at the beginning of my involvement with Mennonites writing. But here's a little bit from the end of my second essay in here, bringing experience to consciousness. I'm referring, when I say gathering work from Mennonite writers, I put together and published an anthology of Mennonite writing called A Cappella Mennonite Voices in Poetry, which was published in 2003. And so it took me about 8 years to do that. It was long, arduous. I went through several family moves. I'm so glad the internet was invented back then. I had another small child. It was crazy, but it came out. So I think, you know, I can appreciate all of the work that went into this too. So gathering work from Mennonite writers has taught me that there is no representative Mennonite experience or Mennonite. Even trying to find population statistics for this paper, which was on comparing Canadian and Mennonite writers in certain, and US Mennonite writers in certain ways, has been a bewildering experience. Mennonites are passionately local, bound to particular histories and genealogies, as well as spiritual and communal practices. But they are also a social, writerly people who are in the midst of flux and transition. In other words, very much alive. Mennonite literature is a way we can bring our own Mennonite experience to consciousness and share it with each other. I hope that in the midst of those arguments about deeply held traditions, we will also open the doors to new Mennonite voices from African American, Cheyenne, Laotian, African Indian, and many other contexts. And at least in literature, Mennonites should include among their numbers, in true Anabaptist spirit, the heretics, the fellow travelers, all those deeply marked and formed by Mennonite lived experience, including those who keep it alive by passionate resistance.
back to 1873 and H.B. Burkholder's editorial, What Do You Read? It would fill a volume to write in detail of the harm and loss attending novel reading, and the evil consequences resulting from this bad habit. But the poisoning sting left behind is perhaps best known and felt by its victims. So enslaved is the mind of the reading public by this monster evil, that many of the secular newspapers of the day contain a novel every week, frequently occupying several columns and generally printed on the first page. In this way, these false stories find their way into the hands of many young persons who, not knowing what a novel is, take it for truth, read and believe it. Some weeks ago, a young friend of mine picked up a newspaper and began to read one of these disguised novels. She read a little and smiling looked at me and said, "Oh, here is such a good piece of reading." And then I told her it was fiction and explained to her the evil of novels, after which she threw the paper aside and faithfully promised to read no more such trash. Young persons have confessed to me that when they become addicted to reading novels, their minds are almost wholly occupied with the same, and they quite willingly went without their meals, sometimes sacrificed half a night or more of necessary sleep to ponder over these pages of falsity. Now, dear friends, I hope you see plainly that there are many and cogent reasons why we must not read novels. First, the time and money spent should be devoted to much better purpose. The money spent for novels would buy bread for many a poor and hungry beggar, and buy good books, which teach us the truth and which can be read with profit. Again, time is much too precious to devote even a moment to such a vanity, even if it made no bad impression upon the mind. If we visit the insane asylum, we find there cases of hopeless insanity, the fruits of reading novels.
That alone makes me want to buy whatever, read the book. I'm feeling full of gratitude to Rob and to Sue, of course, but also sitting there thinking, you know, we are very lucky, we Mennonite literary people, in having had not just people like Rob, brilliant critics, but people who have been in that position in varying kinds of power. I don't know what kind of power Rob has. He was chair for a while, I think. Busy people who also have done things to nurture and bring us together, right? There was Hildy, there is Hildy. And this piece, I'm going to read just a very short paragraph, is owing to Harry Lowen. And Harry Lowen has a lot to answer for when it comes to me, because he was the one who kept asking me to do stuff about Mennonites when I was saying, okay, I'm not really sure what. And so he invited me to give 3 lectures at University of Winnipeg as chair of Mennonites, chair of Mennonite studies there, and which was an overwhelming invitation for me. That was 1992, and I gave 3, one on the making of Mennonite story, one on the making of Mennonite song, which was about nursery rhymes, a low German nursery rhymes, and the making of Mennonite images, which all of them are the beginning of what I wrote in Making Believe. Anyway, this one is Escape from the Bloody Theatre. First time I ever read the Martyr's Mirror, bought a copy of the Martyr's Mirror to do this. And I've just got a couple of sentences from it. If you focus, as I have started out doing, on oral stories rather than printed ones, you are forced to put things together that have been carefully kept apart. Letting in these oral voices can be entertaining, but it may also threaten the fabric of the history we have constructed. The view that historical patterns, the Exodus pattern, for example, are not constructed by us, but rather found in the events, leads easily to the view that the pattern is divinely revealed. Maybe the pattern of the Mennonite Exodus is a way of responding to the fact that the refugee story runs away from the martyrdom story. Gary Waite refers to, quote, a tension between martyrdom and survival, unquote, in his study of methods of survival used by David Joris. This tension may be at least as important in Mennonite writing as the theology of martyrdom by itself. Indeed, the opposing poles of these 2 concerns may help to account for the fact that the phenomenon of the contemporary literary explosion is happening specifically among Russian Mennonites in Canada. It is here where the refugee or survival story dominates over the martyrdom story. is it not possible that with this comes a celebration of survival that allows for the deceits practiced by literary artists?
Thank you, Minnie. We're going to leap forward to 1904 to the pages of the Mennonite and H.G. Albach. The title is Mennonite Fiction. Our daily newspapers give us the following book announcement. Helen R. Martin has opened what seems to prove a new and promising field in fiction in her Tilly, a Mennonite Maid, which the Century Company will publish this month. Material for the study of Pennsylvania Dutch life and character was gained in Mrs. Martin's years of residence in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where her father was a pastor of a Lutheran church. Since at the time of this writing it's not yet on the market, we don't know much about Tilly, the Mennonite Maid. We predict, however, that her love affair will be about the same as those of another girl less quaint than Tilly. There will be chapters of storm and with a few calm ones sandwiched between them. Chapters next to last will probably marry her to her adored one, while chapter the last will have a balm to spare for everyone whose feelings have been jarred in the foregoing chapters. We shall undoubtedly close the book, leaving behind a peaceful vision of Tilly Jr. in the sweet repose upon her lap of her nodding grandmother, while the setting sun is shredding its evening glow over the big barns, the advertisement-bedecked tobacco sheds, and the fertile fields of Lancaster County. According to the announcement, we are led to believe that the author writes from the standpoint of one who knows, her Lutheran home having been located in a Mennonite community. In the early days, however, Lutheran neighbors investigated Mennonite faith and practices. Result, some Mennonites were executed, others imprisoned, and others driven from the county. We tried to anticipate a more pleasing end for this book's last chapter.
Great to be here with you, Rob. Congratulations and thank you to you and Sue. I'm really looking forward to the impact that this volume is going to have in the conversations that move on from here. I'm Hildy Fraze-Thiessen, and I'm going to read you a little bit from an essay that was written almost 30 years ago. And it probably sounds like that, well, it does sound like that, published in 1998. And it was written for the second conference on Mennonite writing, which took place in Goshen in 1997. I'm gonna need this. In the 1960s, Rudy Weed, Warren Cleaver, Dallas Weed, and a few others were representing in fiction analogs for the Mennonite communities, these writers at least, dominated and defined by a relatively stable religious and cultural orthodoxy. In 1962, we found no recourse for Joseph Douek, the compelling dissenter in his first novel, but for this insightful man, Joseph Douek. I'm just giggling at myself because I tried to edit this and I ended up confusing myself. In 1962, we found no recourse for Joseph Douek, the compelling dissenter in his first novel, but for this insightful man to go away, to abandon the community that had been the object merely of his goodwill. The most significant difference between Joseph Douek and today's Mennos in the margins, or Mennonites, so christened by Sherry Hostetler, is that Douek had no recourse but to leave his communal home once he had given voice to his dissent. The Mennonites, or Mennonites who want to lay claim to their heritage even though they might be ambivalent about much that it represents, Hostetler declared, the Mennonites have no intention of going away. Calling herself a bi-worldly Mennonite, she wrote, I found myself in that crevice between worlds I've fallen into many a time since leaving home 10 years ago. I sometimes felt that I'd taken the Mennonite dictum to be in the world, but not of it. One better. I was living in two worlds, and I wasn't a part of either of them. Hostetler's comments speak to particular contemporary identity issues, but they also reveal the degree to which she and other self-defined Mennonites have come to perceive their community of origin in terms of a binary logic that identifies insiders and outsiders, home and exile, center and margin, Mennonites and Mennonites, and sustains these categories in a posture of opposition. It is true that in Mennonite, Hostetler, like other writers who have situated themselves in the margins, has cleared a space for herself and others to speak. But there is an inherent weakness in her marginal position as she defines it, a weakness rooted in the very binary assumption underlying her work.
Couple more, almost done. I'm going to take us to 1945 to a collection called The Proceedings of the Fourth Conference on Mennonite Cultural Problems. The essay here is by Elizabeth Horst-Bender called The Mennonite Theme in Contemporary American Fiction. As I have suggested before, the Mennonite novel is still to be written. What the American Mennonites have written about each other in fiction is trifling and undignified. Perhaps one of our colleges will produce a writer not only capable of writing well, but also of interpreting an ethical or doctrinal or social problem of the Mennonites in a work of imaginative literature. There are many works, many facets that would lend themselves to tragic treatment, others to the development of a major character, while the whole of Mennonite history could well furnish the material for an epic. The impact of the Anabaptists upon the Reformation contains much material from imaginative writing. A Heteron novel could be a genuine epic. The situation of the Mennonites in Soviet Russia contains the roots of many possible treatments. What is needed is not another narrative events or of a descriptive interpretation, but a serious treatment of some specific problems such as non-resistance or non-conformity, brotherhood, simplicity, or conflict with the state and the world. The contributions of the Anabaptist modern cultures, such as freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, and peace, also contain many possibilities. Few, if any, other religious groups have the wealth of material to choose from and have done so little with it as the Mennonites. The field is before them to turn it to account. Jeff, here's somewhere, Jeff, please.
No. Hi, I'm Jeff Gundy. It's great to see you all. It's wonderful to be here and to add my thanks and appreciation as well to Rob and into this amazing tome, which I'm just now getting to see. I'm going to read a bit from the very end of an essay which is called Toward Post-Peace Poetry. I wrote this in response to my old prophet, Goshen John Fisher, whom some of you will know, who wrote an essay saying that Mennonites weren't doing enough anti-war poetry. And so my essay has really two parts. One, a dual argument. One is that there's more of that kind of poetry around than he seemed to have found. And the other one is that his definition of what peace is and how poets encounter peace needed to be broader and larger. And here we are, many years later. So the thing begins with an account of William Blake, who threw this drunken soldier out of his garden once and got in big trouble. So the soldier is mentioned here at the end. We all know how little good it does merely to curse the soldier or the powers that he serves, but we must continue to resist in every way we can manage, small and large, in poetry and prose, in action and thought and imagination and prayer. Mennonite poets have not done enough, surely, to bring peace to the world. Mennonites have not done enough, or Americans, or white people, or plain people, or people of color, or people with advanced degrees. No one has done enough, and very likely none of us ever will. But that must not stop us from doing whatever we can, and from looking where we can for help. Insufficient and minor as all we do has been and seems destined to remain. Who is to say how much worse things would be without it?
Okay. That is a wrap for the readings from the text. We've read, what, a dozen? So there's another 45 or so we didn't get a chance to dip into. And of course, I hope you'll have a chance to sit down with it at some point. It's excellent doorstop material, but also I like to think worth reading through its entirety. And if you do that, please let me know because I'll be most impressed. Okay, thank you again to coming. Thank you to all of the readers. It's really an honor to share a stage with some of the folks who are presenting. We'll have some questions in just 1 second. I just want to make sure I don't tear up. It's really special to be able to come together with the same people every couple of years, a lot of the same people, and continue on a conversation and disagree, and then go back and realize that they were right, and then to continue the conversation. It's rare to have that sort of sustained conversation, and it's just a real pleasure to be a part of it. So thank you very much for coming. We have a few minutes, I think, for questions that can be directed at me or at any of the people who are reading here. And I see we've got, at least one person ready to go.
Nothing severe, okay? Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Mennonite bookstore to set up for organize today. And the second, thank you to the group, okay? Because I do have some Mennonite. Yeah. So my question is, you group lucky to come here as an immigrant, not as a refugee, okay? One thing. And besides, my question is, when you immigrate, I don't know from where, to come here, this is just only one country or different country together, okay? One thing, because for me, I just come from my country. I am from Vietnam as a refugee, okay? But I don't know your group just come because under the umbrella Mennonite many countries. So I just feel like to connect with a different culture, but under Mennonite. Okay? So for you to come here to settle the life here. So the same thing like to me. So I just say welcome and thank you, and we just do the best for this country.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, were there any other questions?
We've got it covered.
Hi, is this on? Do you have any thoughts about where you see the field of Mennonite literature going? Sorry.
That's all the time we have for that. I mean, one of the arguments of the project is that it's not a singular thing, right? There are many Mennonites writing, there are many different conversations that have run off in all the various directions, as they should. And one of the challenges of gathering the material together is that we end up often, by definition, you end up reading individual texts rather than all the texts, right? And one of the kind of the blessings or the best things about Mennonites writing as this sort of critical conversation that's emerged over the last 30 years is that it has become a conversation among people who are working with each other, building, disagreeing, having this conversation. But of course, there's other work that's being done. And so the genesis of the project, as I mentioned earlier, was to honor that conversation that's happening now, that's built up over the last 40 years, 50 years, if you start to look at who's, the sustained critical conversation. But also to make a little bit of room to say there's other conversations that have happened elsewhere. Folks have run Mennonites writing conferences in the past. There's been Mennonite writing fellowships in the past. There's been literary societies across North America doing work in the past. And we can try and pick up some of those strains and say, what were the conversations, what were the concerns? And hopefully if we get better at that in the past, we're also open to the various strains that we're not always listening to in the present. So do I have guesses about where it might go or where I'd love to see it go? For sure, but the project is such that the hope is to just open my own eyes a little bit better to see where the writers and the critics take us.
And good thing from the group information about fiction, not science fiction. That's
I noticed a thread in a couple of those pieces about the idea of being like, that fiction being deceptive, fiction being a lie, that kind of reaction amongst some Mennonites, at least in the past. And even to this day, there's this, sometimes Mennonite authors get accused of lying, even if they wouldn't say that fiction is a lie, but what you're writing specifically is a lie.
Sure.
So that you still see that in today. But poetry, however, seems like, even though you read that piece where he was criticizing the quality of the poetry, it seemed like the art form of poetry was accepted. So I'm just wondering if there ever was a time when Mennonites thought that poetry was just as bad as novels, or did you not come across that?
Are you ready? Are you just asking this question as a novelist? And
well, no.
Tell us about the poets.
Yeah,
great question. So one of the other limiting factors of the collection, which I was so big that I forgot to mention it, was of course we're focused on English language criticism here. So there's a host of other conversations that have taken place in other languages, of course. One of the things that genuinely surprised me when I got into the archive and started looking at the early poetry, early denominational newsletters and periodicals, was just the enthusiastic embrace of poetry everywhere. People are writing their own poetry, it's classic poetry, there's articles expounding on the poets are special people. There's this embrace of the poets, which when I think of my own upbringing, repeating poems in German to my grandparents and not knowing what I'm saying, I guess I should have recognized that, of course, there was this earlier embrace of poetry. Novelists, not so much. However, Mennonites were not alone in their deep suspicions around, especially dime novels to the end of the 1800s and early 20th century. But if you track, you can track sort of a fascinating, nuanced, meandering discussion around the value of fiction. I read some of the more stringent cautions against novel reading, which you can absolutely find across text. But you can also find people, especially as you go through the decades, starting to say, well, as long as the moral's really clear, this fiction stuff I find sticks with me. And then you can find other people argue, well, it's not that it's lying, but it makes you ethically lazy because you read about these fantastic, terrible things happening and you don't do anything about it. You just go, that was entertaining, and you close it. And flexing that muscle, that response that you're getting, that emotional response, is supposed to move you as a Christian to do something about it. And fiction makes you just flex that muscle but never do anything. And so that's the danger. And so you see this sort of nuance kind of going back and forth. And then there's this great article that we've included in here called The Power of Literature, which says, yeah, literature is super powerful and we need to be using it better, but it is difficult to wield, right? And so there is this emerging conversation that's been taking place over centuries here, certainly, that we can track. The poets, though, they seem to come out on top. I don't know what time.
So this will be our dramatic final question.
Well, last Sunday, many Christians celebrated Pentecost. And as is described in the book of Acts, the first response when people seem to hear a sort of trans-linguistic translation that's going on, that everybody's hearing the same message, even though it's expressed in languages they don't know. The first response of their audience, this diasporic Judeans who were there for the event, is they're drunk. And Peter spends his first few sentences defending himself against the charge of being in some kind of alcoholic binge. And the closest he can get to it, finally, is to his devout audience, is to throw that section from the book of Job at them and say, your young men shall dream dreams, and visions shall come men see. It's kind of a call to, if you want to make an impression on people, let them think you're drunk. Let them think you're crazy. Let them think you're espousing silly, useless views that no decent person. And I think that the more the spirit of rebelliousness and reaching out and speaking truth to power in this day and age is a very worthy motivation for Mennonite writing from a distinctly theological tradition.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few scholars over the years who've said that the true spirit of Anabaptism isn't this quiet in the land that we have allowed ourselves to adopt, but rather a fierce rejection of the state, a loud articulation of protest, and certainly you can find articles to that effect in this text. So drunk or rebellion, but maybe both. Okay. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Robert. Thank you to, apologies to Trina, I know that also attacked Casey earlier on. Thank you very much for being here tonight. It's always so wonderful to have such a wide range of voices, thinkers, and writers in a single room. So it's a great pleasure to play even a peripheral part of the conference that you're all here for. We will be moving on to the signing portion of the evening, so in just a moment we will situate Robert behind this table. Please feel free to come up and have a copy of the book signed. You don't need to pay for it first, but please do pay for it before you leave. We're grateful to CMU Press, obviously, for publishing this book, and to Friesens, of course, to ensuring that it got to us on time. Thank you all so very much for being here, and please do have a wonderful night. Take care.
We try to. One more.